On December 8, 2005, at Baltimore Washington International Airport, just after 5 p.m. local time, Southwest Airlines Flight 1248 was waiting for takeoff clearance, preparing to fly to Chicago. This flight was originally scheduled to depart at 3:50 p.m., but was forced to delay due to poor weather in Chicago, and could only wait for conditions to improve before receiving clearance to depart. Southwest Airlines Flight 1248 was a multi-leg flight. The aircraft would depart from Baltimore Washington International Airport, make a stop at Chicago Midway International Airport, then continue on to Salt Lake City, and finally arrive in Las Vegas. The destination, Chicago Midway Airport, is a city airport with relatively short runways, surrounded by residential areas. As a result, landings there are highly challenging. The aircraft performing this flight was a Boeing 737, in service for less than a year, with approximately 5,273 flight hours and a total of 2,901 takeoff and landing cycles completed. It was powered by two CFM56 7B24 engines and equipped with the most advanced systems of the time. The cabin had a single all-economy layout, accommodating up to 137 passengers, the standard configuration for this model in Southwest Airlines fleet. Southwest Airlines, known for its low-cost operating model and punctuality, had safely operated for over 30 years without any fatal accidents. The company's culture emphasized pilot autonomy, trusting that crew members would make responsible operational decisions without any pressure that might compromise flight safety. The captain for this flight was 59-year-old Bruce Sutherland, with over 15,000 flight hours. He had served 26 years in the U.S. Air Force before joining Southwest Airlines, and had logged 4,500 flight hours on the Boeing 737. The first officer was 34-year-old Stephen Oliver, with a total of about 8,500 flight hours, 2,000 of which were on the Boeing 737. There were 103 people on board this flight, including 98 passengers and 5 crew members. At 5:58 p.m. local time, after a delay of more than 2 hours, Flight 1248 began taxiing and took off smoothly. During the climb and cruise phases, the cockpit remained generally calm. The pilots carefully read through weather reports as a snowstorm over Chicago was intensifying.
Not long after, the crew received the third revised flight plan, which included changes to the runway and braking conditions. The landing runway was changed from the originally planned 04R to 31C. The braking action report indicated good braking on the first and third segments, but poor braking on the second segment. Winds were 11 knots coming from 0-90 degrees, meaning that if they landed on runway 31C, there would be a tailwind component. At around 10,000 feet, the crew began their approach briefing and were instructed by air traffic control to enter a holding pattern because the runway was being cleared at the time. The first officer used this time to input data into the onboard performance computer, simulating different scenarios. The calculations showed that if braking conditions were good, there would be 600 feet of runway remaining after stopping. If braking was poor, only 40 feet would remain. Even so, the system did not issue any warnings because the input wind speed did not exceed the 10-knot operational limit. However, there was a problem. The onboard performance computer assumed that the thrust reversers would be deployed immediately after touchdown, yet the pilots did not mention this in the cockpit. The two pilots discussed several possibilities. If conditions continued to worsen, they could divert to St. Louis or Kansas City. But the current situation was not yet unacceptable, and other aircraft had already landed successfully, so they decided to continue the approach.
At 7:03 p.m. local time, Southwest Airlines Flight 1248 was cleared to intercept the instrument landing system signal for runway 31C. Although visibility had decreased, it was still within acceptable limits. The ceiling was 4,500 feet, above the minimum requirement of 3,000 feet. The tower informed the crew that braking conditions on the runway were good on the first half and poor on the second half.
At 7:14 p.m., the aircraft landed heavily, making a strong impact on the runway. The spoilers deployed and the auto brake system activated. However, a problem immediately occurred. The thrust reversers did not engage. The captain attempted to pull the reverse levers, but they could not be fully raised. Believing that the automatic system would activate on its own, he did not force manual operation. The aircraft began decelerating, but braking effectiveness was poor. The runway was covered by a layer of compacted snow, which severely reduced friction. By the midpoint of the runway, the rate of deceleration had dropped sharply. The first officer anxiously shouted, "Brakes!" The captain immediately increased brake pressure manually, but still did not touch the thrust reverser controls. At this moment, the first officer glanced at the control panel and noticed that the reverse levers were still stowed. Without hesitation, he pushed the captain's hand aside and pulled the reverse levers to maximum power. By the time this was done, 18 seconds had passed since touchdown, and less than 1,000 feet of runway remained. The aircraft skidded on the snow, overran the end of runway safety area, broke through a metal fence, destroyed an instrument landing system antenna, and crossed the airport perimeter road. The aircraft still did not stop. At that moment, at the intersection of 55th Street and Central Avenue, a family car was cautiously driving on the snow-covered road. The plane's fuselage and wing struck the car from the side, crushing it onto another vehicle. 6-year-old Joshua Woods, who was inside, was killed instantly. His parents and siblings were seriously injured. The aircraft finally came to a stop in the middle of the road. As soon as it stopped, the silence in the cockpit was immediately broken by the voices of the cabin crew. They quickly and orderly began organizing the evacuation. The first officer carried out the emergency checklist according to procedure, while the captain went into the cabin to assist the crew with the evacuation. The front left door and the rear right door were opened, and passengers were evacuated directly from the cabin to the sidewalk on Central Avenue. The first to arrive at the scene were the Chicago Fire Department and airport police. They were faced with an extremely complex scene, a passenger jet sprawled across a city intersection, with a destroyed car trapped beneath it and fuel spilled onto the snow. Firefighters found Joshua Woods in the back seat of the family car, showing no signs of life. His parents and siblings were severely injured, and firefighters used hydraulic tools to rescue them. The collision also affected 2 other cars. One was unoccupied, while the other had a private citizen who was injured. 18 passengers on the aircraft sustained minor injuries, mainly bruises, caused by falls or impacts during the evacuation. For the next 2 days, the aircraft remained at the intersection. The landing gear had to be partially dismantled, and the nose was lifted onto a platform. On December 10, the plane was towed back to the airport for final inspection. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, led the investigation, and from the very beginning sent a full investigation team to Chicago Midway Airport. The investigation focused on 3 key aspects: weather conditions, crew decision-making, and the use of automated systems. The first finding was that the thrust reverser system was activated only 18 seconds after the aircraft touched down. The flight data recorder made it very clear. There was no mechanical malfunction, and the system itself was functioning normally. The delay was entirely caused by human factors. After touchdown, the captain did indeed try to immediately pull the thrust reverser levers, but failed to move them fully into position, and afterwards never tried again. So, why didn't the captain persist in operating the thrust reverser system? This leads to the second investigation finding. The auto brake system caused a distraction. For both pilots, this was the first time using the auto brake system in an actual flight.
The captain focused his attention on the automatic deceleration instead of manually confirming whether the thrust reversers had successfully deployed. At this point, the aircraft's deceleration was already noticeably insufficient. The first officer did notice this, but reacted too late. It wasn't until he called out "brake" and looked down at the center control panel that he realized the thrust levers had not been pulled. By the time the first officer finally deployed the reversers, the aircraft had already gone beyond the normal braking distance. The investigation report also contained strong criticism of the performance computer software. Although it could calculate braking distances, it did not clearly state that the calculation assumed the thrust reversers had been deployed, nor did it give a clear warning. The wind speed was also set by default to the maximum allowable value. These underlying assumptions lacked intuitive prompts. Another key factor was that the pilots had not received sufficient training for mixed braking conditions.
Southwest Airlines' explicit policy is that if a runway braking report contains both good and fair ratings, the fair rating, the less favorable one, should be used as the standard. However, this rule was neither written into the operating manual nor incorporated into recurrent training. As a result, both pilots were unaware of it. The pilot's decision not to divert was also re-examined. Although the aircraft had sufficient fuel, the pilots did not choose to fly to Kansas City or St. Louis. Based on the data provided by the onboard performance computer, there was no external pressure influencing them, but there was an operational inertia. Previous flights had indeed landed successfully under similar conditions. Finally, the investigation also uncovered a major infrastructure issue. Runway 31C at Midway Airport lacked an EMAS, Engineered Materials Arresting System, and did not have the FAA-recommended 1,000-foot safety overrun area. The end of the runway had only about 82 feet remaining. NTSB simulations later determined that if a 230-foot-long EMAS had been installed at the end of runway 31C, the aircraft could have come to a complete stop within the airport boundaries. The final investigation report attributed the probable cause of this accident to the failure to deploy the thrust reversers in time. And several factors contributed as important indirect causes, including insufficient pilot training, ambiguous settings in the performance software, unclear operational policies, and deficiencies in airport infrastructure. This was the first fatal accident in Southwest Airlines history. After the accident, the airline revised its training policies, updated the onboard performance computer to provide clearer warning information, and strengthened winter operations training. Chicago Midway Airport also began installing EMAS, Engineered Materials Arresting Systems, at the ends of runways. This incident triggered a major response in both the media and regulatory circles. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, established a Takeoff and Landing Performance Assessment Rulemaking Committee task force to reform contaminated runway assessment procedures. Since 2016, the FAA has officially introduced a new digital runway condition code system to standardize the reporting and assessment of runway conditions. The aircraft involved in the incident was later repaired, repainted, and re-registered as N286WN. Less than a year later, it was returned to service and remains in Southwest Airlines' fleet to this day.